There is a city beneath your city. Not a metaphor. Not a myth. A literal, physical city with walls, floors, drainage systems, vaulted corridors, and in some cases, rooms still sealed buried under the streets you walk every day. In Edinburgh, Scotland, a fully intact street from the 1600s sits undisturbed beneath the Royal Mile. In Rome, there are 17 layers of continuous habitation stacked below modern pavement. In Istanbul, engineers drilling a railway tunnel in 2004 broke into a harbor that nobody knew existed along with the remains of over 35 Byzantine-era ships, perfectly preserved in the silt. In Chicago, Boston, and Seattle, entire building facades, storefronts, and sidewalks from the 1800s exist one floor below street level, some with signage still intact, some with merchandise still on shelves. These aren't ruins. They're not collapsed. They are cities that were buried systematically, deliberately, and in some cases with the original population still living in them. And the question that nobody in official archaeology, urban planning, or conventional history seems to want to answer directly is this. Why were so many cities, across so many different continents, buried under new foundations at roughly the same historical period? What you are about to hear is not fringe speculation. The evidence is in the ground. It has been there the entire time. We simply have not been taught to ask why. There is a pattern running beneath every major city on Earth. Not a metaphor. A structural pattern. A repeating sequence of events so consistent across geography, culture, and time period that the word coincidence stops being a useful explanation. Cities are built. Cities are buried. New cities are constructed on top of them. Official history assigns explanations: fire, flood, earthquake, population growth, modernization. In some cases, those explanations are partially true. In most cases, they are radically incomplete. And in a small but significant number of cases, they appear to be deliberate fabrications. Begin with what is knowable. Begin with what is in the ground. Part 1: The Buried Cities That Should Not Exist. In 1851, construction workers in Seattle, Washington began grading the hills surrounding the young city. The process, called the Seattle regrades, involved systematically shaving entire hillsides and using the displaced earth to fill in tidal flats, raise the street level, and effectively bury the original ground floor of every building in the downtown core. What was left was a city beneath a city. The original storefronts, sidewalks, utility systems, and building foundations, some only a decade old, were sealed under the new street level. They did not collapse. They were not destroyed. They were simply covered. Today, you can walk through what is called the Seattle Underground, miles of subterranean corridors that were once the street-level commercial district of a functioning city. The brickwork is intact. The archways are structurally sound. There are original pharmacy cabinets still bolted to walls. There are iron vault doors still hanging on their hinges. The official explanation for the Seattle regrade is a combination of fire damage from the 1889 Great Seattle Fire and a need to modernize the sewer system. Both of those things are true, but they do not explain the full scope of what happened. Because the Great Seattle Fire destroyed approximately 25 city blocks. The area that was subsequently buried and built over was significantly larger. And the timeline of the burial, beginning years before the fire and continuing well after reconstruction would have been complete, suggests a project that was planned independently of the disaster. Someone decided that the city needed to be different. Not rebuilt. Different. The fire was, at minimum, convenient. Now go to Edinburgh. Beneath the Royal Mile, the ancient spine of Scotland's capital, there is a street called Mary King's Close. It is not hidden in the modern sense. You can buy a ticket and walk through it. But for 300 years, it was sealed. The story told to tourists is that Mary King's Close was quarantined during a plague outbreak in the 1640s, that the inhabitants were locked inside to prevent the disease from spreading, and that the entrance was eventually bricked over and forgotten. That story is almost certainly false. The actual historical record shows that Mary King's Close was not quarantined during the plague. The residents left. Some died, but of the plague that was sweeping all of Edinburgh, not of a sealed chamber execution. The street was not bricked over in the 1640s. What actually happened is this: in 1753, the Edinburgh City Chambers, a large civic building, was constructed directly on top of the close. The builders did not demolish the existing structures. They used the buildings as the foundations and lower levels of the new construction. Entire houses, their walls, their fireplaces, their floors, were incorporated wholesale into the substructure of the new civic building. This is architecturally extraordinary. It was not accidental. Someone surveyed those buildings, assessed their load-bearing capacity, and decided to build on top of them rather than through them. The question is why? Why, in 1753, with the resources and manpower to demolish and clear a site properly, did Edinburgh's city planners choose instead to entomb an entire medieval street inside a government building? The official answer is cost and convenience. The existing structures were solid. Why remove them? But that answer becomes less satisfying the more you know about what was found when the close was eventually opened and explored in the late 20th century. The rooms were not empty. When archaeologists and historians began the systematic excavation and documentation of Mary King's Close in the 1990s, what they found were rooms that appeared to have been abandoned mid-occupation. Not cleared. Not looted. Abandoned. There were objects left behind, not valuable objects, not objects that would have been deliberately cached. Ordinary domestic objects. The kind of objects that you leave behind when you leave in a hurry, or when you do not expect to be gone long. One room in particular attracted attention. A small chamber, clearly a child's room, contained a collection of toys and small personal objects arranged against the wall. A small doll. Personal items. Undisturbed for 3 centuries. The archaeologists who documented this room reported an experience that is unusual in formal academic literature. They found the room difficult to process emotionally. Not because of supernatural attribution, the academic reports are careful to avoid that framing, but because of the simple, physical reality that a child's belongings had been left exactly as placed, sealed from the outside world, for 300 years. Whatever happened in Mary King's Close happened suddenly enough that a child left without their things. The official history says, plague. Voluntary evacuation. Normal processes of history. But voluntary evacuations do not leave arranged toys. Voluntary evacuations do not leave domestic objects placed with care. Voluntary evacuations are followed by retrieval by people returning to collect what matters. Nobody returned to Mary King's Close. This pattern, sudden abandonment, deliberate sealing, construction of new architecture over the top, repeats across a range of cities and time periods that begins to demand explanation. In Rome, the layering is so deep and so continuous that professional archaeologists speak of the city as a geological formation. Each major historical transition, the fall of the Republic, the Constantinian shift, the Ostrogothic occupation, the medieval reorganization, corresponds to a literal change in ground level. Buildings are buried not by catastrophe but by construction. The Pantheon, one of the most intact ancient structures on Earth, was deliberately raised above the original city level by the Emperor Hadrian. The original approach, a broad open plaza, colonnaded and ceremonial, now sits nearly 6 meters below the surrounding streets. You descend to enter it. You walk down into the ancient world. This was not natural subsidence. This was not slow accumulation. The entire approach to one of the most significant buildings in Roman history was allowed to be buried under 7 centuries of subsequent occupation until what had been a monument became a pit. The question that professional archaeology has never fully answered is this: what was the intention? At what point did the Roman population stop maintaining the ground level? At what point did they stop clearing the accumulated debris of previous centuries? At what point did they decide or accept that the level of the past was a level they did not need to return to? And who benefited from that forgetting? Part 2: The Archaeology of Erasure. There is a difference between burial and destruction. Destruction removes. Burial conceals. When invaders sacked Rome, they did not bury it. They burned it, broke it, stripped the marble, melted the bronze. Destruction leaves a layer of char, fragmented material, evidence of violence. Archaeologists can identify destruction layers with precision. They are unmistakable. Burial is different. Burial leaves things intact. Burial is systematic. Burial requires infrastructure. You need material to bury things with. You need labor to move that material. You need a decision-making authority to direct the process. And what the subsurface record of city after city shows is not primarily destruction. It shows burial. In Ani, a medieval Armenian city that was once one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London, larger than Paris at its peak in the 11th century, the excavation record shows a city that was not destroyed but abandoned. The structures are largely intact. The churches, the palaces, the market districts, the city walls, much of it is still standing, albeit in partial collapse from 7 centuries of neglect. Ani was not sacked in the conventional sense. The historical record shows a series of invasions, a gradual population decline, and then in the 13th century a sudden and total abandonment. The population did not flee in waves. They left. The city was simply emptied. And then, for reasons that historians classify as political and economic, the surrounding powers allowed Ani to remain uninhabited. They did not resettle it. They did not repurpose it. They left it standing in a depopulated valley, visible from the Armenian-Turkish border, slowly being reclaimed by grass. This is not how cities die in the historical record. Cities are reused. Cities are stripped for building material. Cities are repopulated by whoever comes next. Ani was left standing and left empty. For 700 years. The question of why is one that historians answer with geopolitics and trade route changes and earthquake damage and Mongol invasion. All of which are true. None of which fully explains why an intact, largely standing city was simply abandoned and surrounded by a political and administrative vacuum for 7 centuries. Some places are not meant to be re-entered. Now consider what happens when excavation reveals not just buried structures but buried systems. In 2013, workers drilling the Marmari railway tunnel beneath Istanbul's Bosphorus Strait broke through into what appeared to be an ancient harbor. The site, eventually identified as the port of Theodosius, a Roman-era harbor built in the 4th century, contained not just structural remains but an extraordinary collection of preserved material: ships, rigging, cargo, personal objects, tools, organic material. 37 ships. several of them with their masts still in place. The harbor had not been destroyed. It had been deliberately filled. Systematically filled, over what appears to have been a deliberate process of harbor closure, probably in the Byzantine period. The fill material was not random debris. It was organized. Someone filled this harbor intentionally. And then, above it, the city of Constantinople and later Istanbul was built, covering the filled harbor completely. The streets above it show no indication of what lies below. There are no historical records that clearly document the filling process. The harbor's existence was not recorded in Byzantine administrative documents in any way that survived. A harbor large enough to have serviced the capital of one of the greatest empires in history was deliberately closed, filled, and forgotten. The official explanation is practical. Constantinople's harbors were relocated as the city's commercial geography shifted. The old harbor was redundant. Filling it was logical urban development. But 37 ships. Ships are expensive. Ships are salvageable. Ships are the most economically valuable portable infrastructure in the ancient world. The idea that 37 ships were simply left in a harbor that was being deliberately filled left there as filler, as rubble is not a practical explanation. Those ships were sealed inside the harbor intentionally. They were meant to stay there. Part 3. The pattern of the reset. Across different continents, different centuries, different cultures, the same structural sequence appears. A city or settlement exists. It reaches some level of development, architectural sophistication, population density, administrative complexity. Then, within a compressed historical period, the existing city level is covered, built over, or buried. A new city rises on top of it. The new city exhibits different architectural styles, different administrative structures, different linguistic or cultural markers. And the population of the old city is either absent from the record, reclassified under a new ethnic or cultural label, or described as having been absorbed or displaced by incoming groups. This is the standard historical narrative of urban succession. It is the framework through which we understand the layering of civilizations. And in many cases, it accurately describes real processes of conquest, migration, and cultural change. But the framework has a structural weakness. It cannot account for the cases where the buried city was demonstrably more sophisticated than the one built on top of it. In Cahokia, Illinois, just across the Mississippi River from present-day St. Louis, there stands a complex of earthen mounds that was, at its peak around 1100 CE, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Estimates suggest a population of between 10 and 20,000 people, with a metropolitan region that may have extended to include 100,000. Cahokia had urban planning. The mounds are arranged in a precise geometric pattern. There is a central plaza of approximately 19 hectares, 4 times the size of the Great Pyramid's base, maintained and leveled to a degree that required sustained administrative control. There are wood-henge structures, circular arrangements of large timber posts that functioned as solar calendars. There is evidence of long-distance trade extending to the Gulf Coast, the Great Lakes, and the Atlantic seaboard. And then, in the 13th century, Cahokia was abandoned. Not destroyed. Not conquered. Abandoned. The archaeological record shows a period of rapid population decline beginning around 1200 CE and a complete abandonment of the urban center by 1300. There is evidence of environmental stress, deforestation, flooding. There is evidence of social conflict. A palisade wall was constructed around the central mound complex in the city's later period, suggesting internal conflict or fear of external threat. But the scale of the abandonment is disproportionate to the evidence of its causes. Entire architectural complexes, mounds requiring millions of man-hours to construct, were simply left. The long-distance trade networks that supplied Cahokia collapsed or redirected. The population dispersed into smaller regional groups that, when encountered by European explorers 3 centuries later, had no clear cultural memory of the city their ancestors had built. No memory. No oral tradition that has survived in any clear form. No claim of descent, no ceremonial return, no acknowledgement. A city of up to 100,000 people was abandoned, and within 3 centuries, the knowledge that it had existed was effectively erased from the cultural memory of the surrounding population. This is not how civilizations forget things. This is how civilizations are separated from things. The same pattern: sophisticated urban complex, sudden abandonment, erasure from subsequent cultural memory appears at Catalhoyuk in Turkey, at the Indus Valley cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, at the Bronze Age palatial complexes of Mycenaean Greece, at the cities of the Norte Chico civilization in Peru, at Great Zimbabwe in southern Africa. In each case, the archaeological record shows not gradual decline but rapid transition. Not destruction but abandonment. Not chaos but an organized departure from complexity. And in each case, the civilization that follows, if one follows at all, is demonstrably less sophisticated in some measurable technical or organizational dimension than the one that preceded it. Official historiography has a framework for this too. It is called collapse. Civilizational collapse. The idea that complex societies contain within themselves the seeds of their own dissolution, that environmental stress, social inequality, elite dysfunction, or systems fragility can cause rapid, cascading failure. This framework is supported by genuine research. It has genuine explanatory power. But it does not explain the buried infrastructure. It does not explain the sealed harbors. It does not explain the arranged toys left in sealed rooms. It does not explain the 37 ships. Collapse does not bury things deliberately. Part 4. Who builds on top? When a city is buried and a new city built on top of it, someone is doing the building. This seems obvious. But the historiographical question, who specifically, with what institutional authority, with what stated intention, directing what resources, is almost never examined in the terms in which it should be. Because the answer, when you follow it carefully, tends to lead to a specific and recurring category of historical actor. Not an ethnic group. Not a race. Not a nationality. A function. The function of administration. In city after city, the transition from buried old city to constructed new city corresponds not to a change in population. The physical people living in an area often show genetic and cultural continuity across the transitional period, but to a change in administrative control. A new governing body. A new institutional framework. A new legal and territorial claim. And with that new administrative claim comes, with striking regularity, a new architecture. New street plans. New official buildings. New civic centers built, with symbolic precision, over the centers of the old ones. The Roman Forum was built over Etruscan sacred sites. The Cathedral of Córdoba in Spain was built inside the Great Mosque, which had itself been built within a Visigothic church, which had been built over a Roman temple. The Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan was built over earlier structures that the Aztec themselves recognized as belonging to previous civilizations. This is not coincidence. This is practice. The deliberate placement of new administrative and religious centers over the remains of older ones is a documented, cross-cultural, trans-historical practice. It serves symbolic, political, and some researchers argue deliberately amnesiac functions. You build your new power center over the old one to claim its authority. And you bury what came before so that the population has no physical reminder of what existed before your authority. In Mexico City, this process is visible with a clarity that makes the pattern undeniable. The city center of Mexico City, the Zócalo, the Central Plaza, surrounded by the Metropolitan Cathedral and the National Palace, sits directly over the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. This was not coincidental. Hernán Cortés explicitly directed the construction of the new Spanish colonial city on the foundations of the old one. The administrative buildings of New Spain were built using the stones of the demolished Aztec temples. The cathedral's foundations incorporate original Aztec stonework. The plaza itself mirrors, approximately, the layout of the original Aztec ceremonial center. The choice was deliberate and symbolic. By building the institutions of Spanish colonial power on the physical foundations of Aztec institutional power, Cortés, or rather, the administrative and ecclesiastical apparatus he represented, was making a claim of continuity and supersession simultaneously. We are here. We have always been here. What was here before us is beneath us. And it worked. For 3 centuries of colonial rule, the buried capital of the Aztec Empire was simply the ground that Mexico City stood on. Not a subject of investigation. Not a site of memory. Ground. It was only in 1978, when electrical workers digging a trench in the Zócalo struck a massive carved stone disc depicting the dismembered body of the Aztec moon goddess Coyolxauhqui, that the systematic excavation of the Templo Mayor began. The stone had been there, 2 meters below street level, since 1521. 457 years. In the center of one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Buried. Part 5, The Documents That Disappeared. The physical evidence buried beneath streets and foundations is one category of suppression. There is another category that leaves no trace at all because it was not buried but destroyed. Libraries. The systematic destruction of libraries and written records at moments of political and administrative transition is so well documented that it functions almost as a historical law. Conquerors burn libraries. New religious orders destroy the texts of their predecessors. Administrative reorganizations shred the records of the systems they replace. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, and the most debated because the evidence for a single catastrophic destruction is weaker than the evidence for a prolonged, multi-actor process of degradation, theft, and deliberate culling that extended over centuries. What is less famous, and more disturbing, is the pattern that repeats in cultures that had no contact with Alexandria and no knowledge of each other. When the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica, they encountered a civilization with a sophisticated writing system and an extensive library tradition. The Maya had codices, folded bark paper books that recorded astronomical observations, historical chronologies, religious texts, and what appear to have been administrative records extending back centuries. Bishop Diego de Landa, the Franciscan friar who oversaw the early Spanish religious administration of the Yucatan, conducted a systematic burning of these codices in 1562. His own account records that he burned dozens of them. Indigenous witnesses said the number was higher. He described the Maya response to the burning as one of profound grief, a word that appears in his own report, as if recording something he found notable but not troubling. Of the thousands of codices that the Maya produced, 4 survive. For books, out of thousands, from a civilization that maintained libraries for centuries. The rest were burned in a single afternoon in a town square in Mani. De Landa, remarkably, later wrote his own account of Maya culture, The Relation de las Cosas to Yucatan, which remains one of the primary sources historians use to reconstruct what he destroyed. The men who burned the library also wrote the summary of what it contained. He decided what would survive. He decided what would be remembered. This is the structure of erasure at its most refined. Not simple destruction. Selective destruction followed by controlled reconstruction. You do not simply burn the records. You burn the records and then you write the account of what the records said. You become the mediator between the past and the future. You become the only source. And once you are the only source, the story becomes whatever you say it is. The question that this pattern raises across Mesoamerica, across the early Christian burning of pagan texts, across the systematic destruction of pre-Islamic records in the Arabian Peninsula, across the Soviet destruction of Tsarist archives, across dozens of other historical instances is not whether this happened. It happened. Repeatedly. The question is whether these separate instances of record destruction are connected by anything more than the opportunism of power. Whether there is, beneath the various cultural and religious justifications that each instance offered for its particular burning, a consistent structural motive. The motive of controlling the timeline. Part 6, The Timeline Problem. When you remove the libraries and bury the cities, you do something specific to the timeline. You compress it. The further back in time an event occurred, the more dependent our knowledge of it is on the documentary and archaeological record. The more of that record that is destroyed or buried, the shorter the effective history becomes, not because the past is shorter, but because the evidence for it has been removed. And here is where the pattern becomes most unsettling. The chronology of ancient history, the dates assigned to civilizations, architectural phases, textual periods, and cultural transitions is not as stable as most people assume. It is the product of interpretation, inference, and in some cases, institutional consensus that formed in the 19th century and has been extraordinarily resistant to revision. The date assigned to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, approximately 2560 BCE, is not based on a dated inscription or a contemporary document. There is no text from the 4th dynasty of Egypt that says, "We built this pyramid in this year." The date is calculated backward from king lists, astronomical records, carbon dating of organic material found in the structure, and a chain of scholarly inference that has accumulated over 2 centuries. This does not mean the date is wrong. It may be correct within a reasonable margin. But it means that the entire edifice of ancient Egyptian chronology, and by extension, the chronologies of civilizations that are dated in relation to Egypt, rests on a chain of inference rather than a chain of unambiguous documentation. And when those inferences are challenged, when, for example, geological evidence for water erosion on the Sphinx suggests exposure to prolonged rainfall that could only have occurred before 5000 BCE, significantly earlier than the accepted construction date, the challenge is not simply evaluated on its merits. It is met with institutional resistance. The geologist Robert Schoch, who conducted the original analysis of the Sphinx erosion in 1991, documented not just the technical disagreement with his findings but the sociology of the disagreement, the way in which Egyptological consensus mobilized to reject the implications of geological evidence, not because the geology was demonstrably wrong but because the implications were unacceptable. Unacceptable to whom? Unacceptable to the historical framework that had been built, over 2 centuries, on the assumption that civilization, complex, monumental, architecturally sophisticated civilization, began in Mesopotamia and Egypt in the 4th millennium BCE and developed progressively and linearly from that point forward. If the Sphinx is older than that framework allows, then something was building at a monumental scale before the timeline begins. And the question of what that something was, and what happened to it, and where its remains are, becomes unavoidable. Part 7, What Lies Beneath. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted around Stonehenge, not at Stonehenge itself, but in the surrounding Salisbury Plain, revealed an extraordinary density of previously unknown buried structures. Pits, enclosures, barrows, post alignments, stone settings. The survey, part of the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project, identified hundreds of features that are not visible on the surface. The lead archaeologist on the project described the findings as fundamentally changing the understanding of the Stonehenge landscape. What had been interpreted as a relatively isolated monument was revealed to be the visible tip of an enormous buried complex. This is not unusual. This is what happens every time ground-penetrating radar is applied to sites previously studied by conventional surface archaeology. In 2010, the same technology applied to Stonehenge's sister site at Avebury revealed buried features of comparable scale and density. In 2015, radar surveys of the area around Angkor Wat in Cambodia revealed a previously unknown urban network surrounding the temple complex, a medieval city larger than many modern capitals, buried under jungle growth. In 2018, LiDAR surveys of the Guatemalan highlands revealed, beneath the jungle canopy, a connected network of ancient Maya cities covering an area of approximately 2,100 square kilometers with road systems, agricultural infrastructure, and what appear to be defensive structures, indicating organized conflict on a scale that existing historical models of Maya society had not accounted for. Every time we look with the tools that can see beneath surfaces, we find more than the official record described. Not a little more. Dramatically more. This suggests not that ancient civilizations were simply more extensive than previously believed, though they were, but that the frameworks used to study them were systematically oriented toward what was visible. And what was visible was, by definition, what had not been buried. There is a chamber beneath the Temple of Quetzalcoatl at Teotihuacan in Mexico. Archaeologists discovered it in 2003 when a heavy rain opened a sinkhole near the temple's facade. The chamber, a tunnel approximately 14 meters below ground level, sealed with a boulder at the entrance, running approximately 100 meters toward the center of the temple complex, was excavated over the following decade. What they found inside was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Liquid mercury, approximately several liters of it, pooled in chambers along the tunnel floor. Mercury does not occur naturally in this context. It was placed. The Maya associated mercury with the underworld, with rivers beneath the earth, with the passage between worlds. The presence of liquid mercury in a sealed, buried chamber beneath a temple was interpreted as intentional ritual placement. Also found, thousands of individual artifacts. Rubber balls. Jaguar remains. Human figurines of extraordinary craftsmanship. A large cache of wooden objects preserved by the mercury atmosphere, including what appear to be scepters or staffs. And, in the innermost chambers, 3 sealed burial antechambers that may contain the remains of Teotihuacan's rulers, a burial complex that, if the interpretation is correct, would be comparable in significance to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. The excavation is ongoing. The innermost chambers have not yet been fully opened. What is being excavated, layer by layer, beneath one of the most studied archaeological sites in the Americas, suggests that the most significant contents of Teotihuacan were not in the pyramids that scholars have analyzed for over a century. They were underground. Sealed. Waiting. Part 8, The Cities We Stand On. Return, for a moment, to the mundane. To the streets you know. To the city you live in. If you live in any city with a history older than a century, and most cities in the world have histories much older than that, you are standing on buried material. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a physical fact. The question is not whether there is something beneath you. There is. The question is how much, how old, how significant, and how deliberately it was put there. In London, the Roman city of Londinium, founded in approximately 47 CE, lies beneath the modern city of London at depths ranging from 1 to 6 meters. When construction projects in the square mile break ground, they routinely encounter Roman-era material, floors, walls, coins, pottery, human remains. There is a Roman amphitheater beneath the Guildhall Art Gallery. There are Roman bathhouses beneath the London Wall. There is the remains of a Roman temple to the god Mithras, the Mithraeum, that was discovered in 1954, carefully excavated, and then relocated and preserved beneath a modern office building. Not in a museum. Beneath an office building. In its original location, 2,000 years of history sealed in a climate-controlled basement beneath a Bloomberg facility in the heart of the financial district. The Roman city, functionally, became the literal foundation of the financial city. Whether that is metaphor or archaeology depends on whether you prefer to look at things from street level or from below. In Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, formerly Byzantium, the density of buried material beneath the modern city is so extraordinary that the Istanbul Archaeological Museum maintains an ongoing record of discoveries made during standard construction activities. Water mains, metro tunnels, foundation pits, each major excavation adds to a continuously expanding record. In 2007, construction of the Yenikapi metro station uncovered not just the port of Theodosius and its 37 ships but an entire Neolithic settlement dating to approximately 6000 BCE, 6,000 years before Constantinople was founded. A settlement with housing structures, human remains, wooden artifacts preserved in anaerobic silt, and evidence of a sophisticated coastal community. 8,000 years of continuous habitation, layer upon layer, in a single city. The deepest layers were not found at the margins, not found in remote archaeological surveys. They were found in the center. At the core. Exactly where you would expect to find the oldest things, if you were willing to look. Istanbul's official history begins with Byzas of Megara, who founded Byzantium in approximately 660 BCE. The city's founding mythology, its civic narrative, its sense of historical origin, all of it places the beginning at the 7th century before the Common Era. The ground beneath the city disagrees. The ground says, there were people here, building here, living, complex community lives here, 5,000 years before your story begins. Epilogue. What survives? History, as an institution, is a selective record. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural reality. What is written down, preserved, translated, catalogued, and taught is a fraction of what occurred. And that fraction was selected consciously or unconsciously, by individuals and institutions operating with interests, biases, and constraints that we can partially reconstruct but never fully know. What survives is what someone chose to preserve. What is buried is what someone chose not to clear. And what is buried is, as the physical record increasingly demonstrates, considerably more than the selected history accounted for. The cities beneath the cities are not anomalies. They are the norm. They are the standard condition of urban habitation on a planet whose human history is longer, more complex, more cyclical, and more subject to deliberate erasure than the official record acknowledges. This does not require a master conspiracy. It requires only the repeated, mundane operation of power. New administrators build on old foundations, new ideologies burn old libraries, new civic myths require old ones to be buried or forgotten, new cities are more convenient to navigate when they are not constantly confronted by the physical evidence of what preceded them. The 37 ships in Istanbul's harbor were not sealed there by a secret society. They were sealed there by engineers managing a harbor closure. The toys in Mary King's clothes were not arranged by anyone with sinister intent. They were left behind by a child who expected to return. But the pattern, they are part of the pattern of burial, of erasure, of deliberate construction over the evidence of earlier complexity. That pattern is real. And the question of what it means, what we have lost, what we have been separated from, what knowledge and continuity and connection to the depth of human history was covered by the accumulated weight of centuries of convenient forgetting, that question is not answered by the discoveries. Each discovery deepens it. Somewhere beneath the street you walk today, there is a wall. Possibly a floor. Possibly a room, sealed in the darkness, containing objects arranged by hands that move through air that has not moved since. We will not excavate most of it. We will build over most of it. We will give it new street names and new addresses and new stories about what is important and what is not. But it will remain. It always remains. The question is not whether there is more beneath us than we have been told. The question is what we will do or refuse to do when we finally look. The record is not finished. It never was. If what you heard here unsettles something in you, that unsettlement is the beginning of looking. Stay with it. There is always another layer down.